early December 1993, the small ragtag group of developers known as id Software would introduce the gaming sphere to the technological marvel known as Doom. It was fast-paced, balls-to-the-wall, demon-blasting action. But for as many people who saw Doom as a virtual power fantasy, there was a fraction of players who found it somewhat scary. It wasn't unusual for veteran players of the game to recall getting somewhat of a horror-esque vibe from it. Despite Doom's breakneck and sometimes unserious tone, there are definitely a few moments in the game that could come across as eerie. Wandering through abandoned space stations and gritty hellscapes, adorned with fire and bloodied human corpses, it's not exactly the coziest place to be. Whereas most horror games of this era were either point-and-clicks or platformers with a grimsly coat of paint, Doom puts you through the eyes of the protagonist. Wandering through these dark halls and seeing these demonic creatures attacking you in a first-person perspective would definitely have been a bit of a shocking experience for the time. However, the whole zeitgeist of Doom being a little spooky didn't stop at just a few players being cowardly. Doom and horror seem to cross over more often than we might think. Throughout each passing decade, many talented modders in the community would pitch in their own interpretation of Doom but scary. Whether it's a map set with dark and sinister overtones, a full-fledged gameplay mod, or a recreation of some shit creepypasta. However, if I was to sit here and do a comprehensive review on every single Doom mod that so much as flirts with any horror aspects, well, we'd be here all day. So the goal of this video is to take a select list of, in my opinion, some of the more significant mods, and use them as examples of how this genre has evolved over the years, as well as some interesting findings about their development and history. Starting off in the year 1994, when the player base saw the much anticipated release of Aliens Total Conversion. Aliens TC was the work of one Justin Fisher, who spent a whole 6 months developing it. Justin got the inspiration to create this mod from just the first 5 minutes of playing Doom. I thought Doom could make a great Alien-style game, mainly because the atmosphere was so similar. Probably my biggest inspiration, other than the film, was the experience of my first game of Doom. Despite Doom 2 having already been out when Aliens TC was finished, the WOD was actually made to be played with Doom 1. The WOD is a single-episode campaign based on the film Aliens. The demons have all been replaced with xenomorphs and facehuggers, and the levels take place in various sets from the movie. But the essence of this mod doesn't just come from its appearance. What Aliens TC managed to excel at is completely subverting the expectations of the average Doom player. For example, the first level of the game takes place in a seemingly abandoned ship hangar. There's no sign of any activity first, but obviously as you explore further into the indoor parts of the building, there's going to be some enemies waiting for you, right? There's a fully constructed and explorable facility housing an array of weapons and items. But as you walk down every hall and look around every corner, you'll slowly start to realize that the whole joint is totally lifeless. The first level doesn't have any enemies in it whatsoever. While this might not sound like a big deal, it was a jarring and unheard of choice of level design at the time. When people played Doom, they always expected to be shooting demons in the face right from the get-go. There's a looming suspense throughout the whole level because of the expectation that enemies could be in any one of these enclosed spaces, only for there to be nothing at all. Although the tension does kind of get ruined when you've got Sergeant Apone yapping in your ear every now and then.
Those corners. Those corners.
It's not until the second level where you have your first tango with the xenomorphs. There's these sections in some of the levels where the room has been completely coated in green alien goodness. If the suspense from the first level wasn't bad enough, now you're being made to roam right through enemy territory, trudging through these dark green corrupted halls where a gang of xenomorphs could jump you at any moment. It was no longer a question of if there are hostiles, it was where. Scattered around inside the alien hives are also these eggs that will sometimes hatch a facehugger if you get too close to it. Now you might be thinking, what enemy in Doom 1 could even do such a thing? There's no pain elementals or arc vials, so they're out of the question. How is it possible that this thing is literally spawning an entire creature? You see, Aliens TC was monumental not just because it was the first horror mod, but it was also the first total conversion. It would be easy to say that Justin just took a bunch of Doom's in-game graphics and swapped them with something alien-themed, but it's not quite as simple as that. You see, during the 90s, it was actually possible to mod Doom in a sense. This was done with something known as dehacked. Dehacked was an editor that allowed people to change certain aspects of the Doom executable, such as text strings, numerical values, and state frames. Being able to alter the frame sequence of Doom's entities essentially means that you can change the way they behave. For example, you can make imps shoot rockets, barrels that hunt you down and explode, and of course, make the pistol not suck ass. Although dehacked was very limited, if you were clever enough you could make significant changes to the way vanilla Doom is played. After seeing the critical acclaim that Aliens TC got, Justin realized that this was his calling. His talent for creating immersive and groundbreaking mods was being recognized by the masses, and so after foreseeing such a promising future as a mod developer, Justin took this opportunity to go on hiatus. In '96, Justin would return to begin development on another Doom mod called Nemesis Experiment. Rather than a total conversion, this one had the earnest goal of showing off the untouched potential of the Doom engine. Although production started in '96, an unfinished build would be released on the id Games archive in 2005? Almost an entire decade later? Good God, man, what are you doing? The only reason I'm even bringing up this unfinished proof of concept is because this mod features one of the very first wholehearted attempts at a surreal and non-Euclidean Doom map. And that's gonna be very relevant later. Unfortunately though, it was around this point where Justin was starting to become disinterested in making Doom content. Justin's sudden burnout was a combination of being tied up with college and feeling like it was no longer feasible to make mods for Doom anymore. I wanted to do another conversion, and I'd planned and designed a fair bit of it before I realized that the time was past. It would probably take me another 6 months to do the conversion, and by that time, Doom and Doom 2 would be on the way out. Alas, Nemesis Experiment was never finished, and Justin Fisher would retire from the Doom community. I seriously wonder if Justin was even aware of the new modding tools that would come out later. Just imagine what he could have made with something like GZ Doom. Unfortunately, we'll never know. On the flip side though, Justin would actually find work in the games industry, being credited on such hit titles as Kung Fu Panda 2, and Skylanders Giants, and Over the Hedge, Hammy Goes Nuts. I'd say he's living larger than most of us. It's almost impossible to put Doom and horror in the same sentence without at least thinking about its two most outlandish console ports. Doom's PlayStation and N64 ports stand out for their bold decision to completely rework the tone of the game. The sound design has had a complete overhaul, the levels have all had their brightness turned down, and the rockin' MIDI tunes have been replaced by dark atmospheric tracks. But what exactly was the thought process that led to this design decision? It started when id Software were approached by Williams Entertainment, saying that they were interested in developing a port for Nintendo's newly announced Ultra 64 console. However, at this point Nintendo were being all hush-hush about the console's hardware specs, so alternatively Williams proposed another home console, the Sony PlayStation. The devs decided to use Doom's Atari Jaguar port as the foundation for this project. As the developers were tinkering with the game, they would also run several experiments to see just what the PlayStation could bring to the table that the PC version couldn't. Colored lighting and dynamic reverb, alpha transparency, animated skyboxes. As more and more technical embellishments were added in, it became apparent to the developers that this version of Doom was becoming much more stylized compared to its other iterations. It wasn't until it came to making the sounds and music, however, that this style would truly find its footing. You see, Bobby Prince, the guy who made Doom's music and sound effects, had a deal with id Software where anytime the game got ported, he would receive royalties for his sound work. Williams, however, didn't really feel like giving him those royalties. So instead they hired a guy named Aubrey Hodges to do the sound design. Aubrey's music started off having a rock and roll type of sound, much like Bobby Prince's soundtrack. But then he thought it sounded like shit and scrapped it all. As Aubrey was playing around with music software, he noticed that playing samples at a dramatically low key would produce these low, bizarre, and almost monstrous sounds. When you messed with that, taking it way down into negative numbers, the sounds were crazy. It sounded like my room was going to explode. I was thinking, man, this is creepy stuff. I discovered patterns where the more complex the sound was as I lowered it, it became more deliciously weird and scary. Then I developed techniques to get the results I wanted as I lowered them. So Aubrey got the idea to compose a series of dark, ambient tracks that would play throughout the levels. It was very cool to hear, and something I feel could really lend some of the same emotional responses while playing the game as the more frenetic music did. Instead of pumping you up by getting your adrenaline flowing, I'm pumping you up with nervousness and twitchiness. It still made you feel nervous and on edge, and that was the goal. This sinister and grimy soundscape that Aubrey created complemented the game's bleak aesthetic to a T. And so with this port's release, Doom's roots as a horror game was cemented even further. And then Williams became Midway and the N64 came out. The technical prowess that the N64 had over the PS1 meant that getting Doom to run on it was an absolute cinch. And so Midway took this opportunity to go completely balls out with this game's design. It would be unfair to say that Doom 64 was just the PlayStation version but with a brand new coat of paint. Whereas the PlayStation port's theme was almost purely incidental, it was evident that Midway was steering Doom 64 towards the horror theme right from the get-go. Even in later mainline titles, id Software seemed to insist on this horror action formula. With the unveiling of the id Tech 4 engine, the potential for using lights, shading, and color tones to create an imposing atmosphere was greater than ever.
Psychological services are free and confidential.
In the same year that players would celebrate the game's 5th anniversary, something special would be unveiled. Something that would change the face of Doom modding for years to come. The Z-Doom source port would open the floor for an unprecedented amount of mapping capabilities. But it wasn't until 2002 when Z-Doom's true potential would be realized, because that was when the port introduced what would essentially be the backbone of Doom's entire modding scene. Decorate is a script language that allows users to customize pre-existing enemies, weapons, and items, or create their own from the ground up. And so from this point onward, Z-Doom and its many successors would be the port of choice for people wanting to make something more ambitious compared to your typical WOD. And as the technology continued to advance, so did the horrors. The Ghoulish Forest trilogy is the work of Cutman Mike, a rather famous face who went on to make other hits such as Mega Man Deathmatch, Corruption Cards, and of course his underrated classic, Racist Skin. The WODs were often held in high regard for how well they managed to startle the player. However, they were also sometimes criticized for the gameplay loop being pretty bare bones. Ghoulish Forest, you're in a giant box and there's a flying PNG that kills you. Ghoulish Forest 2, you're in a giant box and there's a flying PNG that kills you. Ghoulish Forest 3, you're in a giant box and there's several PNGs that kill you.
It's what the kids call epic fail.
Shortcomings aside, the cultural significance that these WODs have on the community is undeniable. And like many big things, the series started with humble beginnings. According to Mike's old website, he initially made the first Ghoulish Forest just as a prank to scare his friends. A simple boxed-in forest area housing a devious monster by the name of Choke. The WOD was never intended to be published, serving as just a simple inside joke. However, soon afterwards, Mike would publish another WOD titled Space Die. This WOD was met with a warm reception, being praised for its tense cat and mouse style gameplay. The people who played Space Die wanted to see Mike dabble in more scary Doom maps. And since he already had Ghoulish Forest in the backlog, he added an exit, converted the monster from dehack to decorate, and uploaded it for all to see. The Z-Doom forums thread that Ghoulish Forest first appeared in was posted in 2003. However, it wouldn't be uploaded to the id Games archive until 2 years later. The WOD was met with a mostly positive reception. Many people praised it for how much it scared the living daylights out of them, while others found it rather trite or gimmicky. Well, that just scared the fuck out of me like 7 times! Never understood the point of this series, frankly. Oh dear god, it screamed me to death! Not funny, neither scary. Fail.
Complete shit. Just like everything else Cutman Mike makes.
Oh, hang on, what's this? This guy named Waterholic just made a Doom World post about a mod he's working on called Total Chaos. It's a shame I can't see any screenshots of it right now, but judging by the reception, it seems to be in a bit of a rough state, so I would give it at least 13 more years. Anyway, the success of Ghoulish Forest would impel Mike to make a sequel. This one would see a vast improvement on the forest design and ambience. This time you're being hunted by a different ghoul named however the f*** you pronounce that. The key difference between this and the first game is that you actually have a remote chance of winning. The first Ghoulish Forest was next to impossible, with the enemy having a ludicrous movement speed, making it unreasonably hard to land shots as well as evade it. Although this is most likely a byproduct of it being made out of boredom. In the second game, every time you damage the ghoul, it'll teleport off to one of several spawn points on the very edge of the map. While this process of shooting the ghoul and waiting for it to show up again might sound like a total cakewalk, this is countered by the ammo for your super shotgun being reasonably scarce, so you're encouraged to wander around in the forest to look for more pickups should you run out. Ghoulish Forest 2 was even more of a hit than the previous one, although there was still a vocal minority of players who simply weren't impressed by the whole gimmick of what would eventually become a niche subgenre of Doom WOD. Ghoul WODs. It was around this point where the Ghoulish Forest series was starting to garner a bit of a cult following, with authors big and small trying their hand at making their own Ghoulish Forest with blackjack and hookers. There's even a section on Mike's odd website showcasing a bunch of fan-made Ghoul WODs that he came across. Some of these entries include Dark Barren Forest, Smiley Forest, Ghoul Realms Torn City, Midnight Island, Ghoul's Forest Gaiden, and of course, Ghoul Realms Torn City Gold Edition. Some of these WODs would unfortunately be lost to time due to their links expiring. The ones that are still available were put on the id Games archive, because anything that gets put on that site will stay there until the heat death of the universe. It wouldn't be long before Mike wanted to start development on the third Ghoulish Forest. However, before he could start making it, he needed the ingredients. 1. Some pointers on making a better forest level. 2. A DVD rip of The Grudge 2. 3. Some 3D models of trees. 4. Someone to do the ACS scripting. And 5. Tar. The problem I and many have with the Ghoulish Forest is that there's this big border around the outside of the forest. Not only is it ugly, but it can be abused to make the level easier. Some ideas were thrown around in this thread on how to circumvent this issue. Why not use a skybox and set the border lines to teleport the player to the other side of the forest? I rather like the idea of being sucked in by dark magic. The issue with using teleporters is not only would it screw with the ghoul's AI, but it would be jarringly obvious when you got teleported since you'll see the ghoul suddenly disappear. As a band-aid solution, people suggested the screen slowly turn pitch black when nearing the edge of the forest. Someone even suggested implementing the Grue into the game, a monster from the text-based adventure Zork, which would kill you if you stayed in dark places for too long. Ultimately, though, Mike would just keep the large wall border. Mike originally wanted one of the ghouls to resemble Kayako from The Grudge, hence why he wanted footage from the movie. I can't say why I need this, but let's just say I'm taking Nash's idea of having the generic female in a white dress with long black hair, because it's so popular and apparently freakier. Animated female ghosts sounds scary. Make her head twitch unnaturally. You know, some people I know would be aroused by this. However, this idea would get scrapped too because apparently the sprites were too hard to make. So the role would instead be taken by Sadako from The Ring, or Samara if you're lame. The 3D tree models that Mike wanted to use as opposed to the sector-based ones had been completed, but due to the fact that the year was 2007, they would cause severe frame rate issues. So they also got binned. Finally, after a laborious development process, Ghoulish Forest 3 would finally hit the shelves. Does anyone else think this menu looks like a cemetery album? Since this is Ghoulish Forest 3, instead of just one ghoul, there are now 4. The guy from the second game makes a return, but joining him are his friends Jitterskull, the Creeper, and the final boss of the game, the Yuri. Another significant addition is the fact that you now use a bow as a weapon. While it might seem like a hassle to use, it does well at amping up the tension during every ghoul encounter. Having a gun would make the fight seem trivial at worst. Just look at the enemy and click the mouse button. Now you have to micromanage things like keeping the bow drawn and waiting for the right moment to release it, as well as accounting for the projectile speed of the arrows. There's no ammo pickups anywhere in the map, so you only have a finite amount of shots. You can pick the arrows back up after firing them, but if you're blindly shooting at the ghoul in a Hail Mary, you can only keep track of the arrows for so long before they get lost like those tiny Lego pieces. So it'd be wise to ensure that every shot counts. As soon as a new game is started, you're put next to a campfire that only stays alight for a few seconds. As soon as the fire goes out, it's on site. One of the 3 main enemies will spawn in and immediately be on the warpath. Thing is, you don't have much of a clue which ghoul you're gonna fight until you come face to face with it. The suspense of waiting for any one of these monstrosities to come out from the shadows is enough to make a few hairs stand up. The screamy face guy behaves the exact same way he does in the second game. Jitterskull has a similar attack pattern, although instead of flying around, he teleports frantically towards you. If he gets too close before his next movement, he'll do a lunge attack that can only be stopped by a well-timed shot. The Creeper is the more infamous of the ghouls, being pretty hard to spot and only having a quiet murmuring sound to indicate its presence. Once all 3 ghouls have been vanquished, the final showdown begins. And it kinda blows. The way the fight with the Yuri works is that you only have about half a minute to shoot her before you get an instant game over. She'll constantly phase in and out of view for a split second. Each time she does this, she'll be at a random angle around where you're currently standing, meaning you have to keep your head on a swivel if you want to catch a glimpse of her. It's a complete pain in the ass trying to land a shot, made up for only by the fact that it just takes 1 shot to kill her. If you take too long, however, this happens. It's safe to say that Ghoul 3 was the apex of the series, having a much more refined gameplay loop and diverse enemy roster.
No! Now you've got my weapon!
Unfortunately though, Mike would go on to say that he had no plans on making another Ghoul WOD. Sorry, but I won't be making any more Ghoul WODs. Why? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, it's getting old. It's the same looking forest, same 1-frame ghouls, and the same atmosphere. People won't keep playing if there's nothing new. Many people didn't get it or just didn't like the style of it. Maybe they were just too chicken, but either way, there's a lot of Doomers who just want to play good old Doom, and I don't blame them. Ghoul 1 was an experiment, Ghoul 2 improved it a little, and Ghoul 3 brought it up to the standard of Doom mods today. Unless Doom gets some kind of virtual reality thing going on, there won't be any more Ghoul. Sorry. Despite the swan song that Mike had given to the Ghoulish Forest series, the WODs had already cemented themselves knee-deep in Doom history. And then it got kinda weird from there. However, it would only be a few years later when these games would incidentally find themselves tapping into one of the richest markets on the internet.
My name.
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier.
Hello and welcome to Cry Plays Ghoulish Forest 3.
YouTube during the late 2000s to early 2010s was what some might refer to as the Let's Play era. The most popular types of videos being made were Let's Plays. The most popular type of YouTubers were Let's Players. And if there was one genre of games that people enjoyed watching the most, it was horror games. People loved watching the funny little guy in the corner of the screen flip their shit as the monster on the screen goes oogly woogly. It was already evident that Ghoul 3 was made with the intent of getting an intense reaction out of those who played it. So it fit the bill perfectly. Ghoul 3 would eventually start to grab the attention of many different YouTubers, even some of the biggest names on the platform. It did numbers. Because of this, Ghoulish Forest 3 would go down as one of the first Doom mods to go viral. And it wouldn't be the last either. To this day, Ghoulish Forest still remains as a cult classic within the Doom community, with a few different remakes and reimaginings of the game being made in recent times. Going back to the topic of YouTube's golden age, it was also around this time when the horror genre was having a bit of a paradigm shift. The most well-known games of this era were being made by independent developers, games like Amnesia, Slender, and Outlast, and it was this new wave of horror games that would go on to influence the next generation of Doom horror mods. The name Ghosted 2 would imply that at some point there was a Ghosted 1, and that was definitely the case. However, I searched high and low through different forums and sites and I couldn't find any mention of this mod anywhere. The only shred of this mod's existence I could even find were these YouTube videos from over a decade ago.
Мать твою. Блять.
What I did observe from these videos is that the gameplay is pretty much identical to that of a Slender game. You wander through this dark labyrinthine building in search of pages, all the while you're trying not to get got by, you guessed it,
The Slender Man!
Another novelty that this mod had was its multiplayer compatibility. It was fairly common for mods like these to have been developed with the intent of being used in the Zandronum source port, an offshoot of Doom that prided itself on its multiplayer-oriented features. While playing horror games by yourself can be a thrilling experience on its own, playing with friends can provide a more entertaining aspect, although the tricky part is actually convincing your friends to get it. Ghosted 2 was released sometime after the first one. Compared to its predecessor, version 2 was very... Wait a second. This looks exactly like the first one. What about that other Ghosted 2? Oh, I see. It's Ghosted 2 version 2. That's not confusing at all. The real Ghosted 2 was leagues above the previous one. The gameplay was still the same page hunt as before, but the level design is of much higher quality. There's also several different levels to play on, and several different enemies that'll pursue you. Recently a version 3 of the mod has been released, and although still in development, this version would see some major revisions to the gameplay mechanics, with new items and enemy AI implemented. There's 4 different ghosts that the game picks at random to hunt you down once you've collected your first page. The skeleton moves fairly quickly, but you can slow it down by looking at it, at the cost of a bit of your sanity. The girl has a special attack that drains a huge chunk of your flashlight's battery if you have it equipped, so it's a good idea to put it away and use some other light source if she's nearby. The Shadow has a ridiculous movement speed, making him impossible to outrun. but he's deterred by flames, so if he's on your tail, just simply whip out either a lighter or a match and keep moving away from him until he eventually scampers off. And the Slender Man, it's the Slender Man, what more can I say? One pretty sneaky thing that this game does is that at completely random intervals when you're not looking, it'll switch out whichever ghost is in the map. One moment you're being chased by one ghost, then suddenly a different one is after you. The precautions you might have been taking to prepare for a certain ghost would have been for naught, since now you're being forced to switch up your game plan a bit. Once you've played through every level and ran into every ghost, you might think that you've seen all there is to see in this mod. And you'd be wrong. There's a few little secrets and Easter eggs that this mod hides from you. In one of the rooms in the house, you might have noticed there's this poster depicting what looks like a satanic ritual site, with a bunch of numbers and a label saying Nightmare and Hell, which is the names of the two hardest difficulties in the game. Now, I'm not entirely sure what exactly this poster means, and I've got a funny feeling we're yet to actually see, because keep in mind this mod is still a work in progress. You can actually find the giant pentagram depicted here by flicking this secret switch and going down these stairs. Again, I don't think this actually does anything yet. After having already completed the tutorial in the basement, you'd think there'd be no reason to go back down there. You can't play through the tutorial again, and it's not like there'll just suddenly be a oh. Going down into the basement a second time will let you explore this labyrinth of identical looking rooms and halls. And while it might seem like this maze has no exit, if you persist enough you'll come across this long corridor with a ghostly figure at the other end of it. You're suddenly taken into the facility level of the game. At least, that's what it looks like. You'll notice that a lot of the textures and architecture is dumbed down a little, even using some of Doom 2's stock assets. There's also no pages anywhere for you to collect, so all you can really do is just wander around in this building aimlessly until eventually you collect my pages. Ah! I'm collecting your pages, dude. Ghosted 2 version 3 is only available for GZ Doom, as it's much too advanced for Zandronum, since that port gets updates about as consistently as Team Fortress 2. Speaking of GZ Doom, did you know that at some point people actually thought it was gonna cease development? And it was all because of a mod that looked like this. In 2017, a user named Anatak had the ingenious idea of, what if it were possible to cartridge tilt Doom? And so the release candidate for a map set titled Lilith.pk3 was announced. Upon first glance, it was obvious that this mod was going for the gimmick of looking as glitchy and broken as possible. Despite the entire thing looking like a Vine-source corruption stream, a great deal of people were intrigued by the avant-garde approach this mod was taking. What was unusual about this mod, besides everything else, was that it required the most recent version of Z-Doom to play it. At this point, Z-Doom's development had already been discontinued, so why is it important to use a seemingly outdated source port to run this mod? It's because this map set also utilizes various different rendering bugs that aren't present in any of Z-Doom's forks. GZ Doom and Zandronum both use hardware acceleration to render Doom's maps in 3D environments, without any of the dithering that comes from Doom's limited color palette. Various scripts and intentional mapping goofs have been implemented to ensure the levels look as though your computer's being lobotomized. It's a peculiar word, sure, but you might be asking, how exactly is this a horror mod? Well, I mean, just listen to it, man. Imagine sitting in your room in the dead of night playing your favorite childhood game, when all of a sudden the whole thing starts tweaking out on you. If there's one thing that Lilith excels at, it's tapping into that uncanny feeling of witnessing the graphical integrity of a video game going completely awry. The overall reception for this mod was pretty mixed. For as many people who were impressed by this WOD's visual accomplishment, there were as many people who thought it was just a meaningless eyesore. But none of these naysayers would come close to matching the seething hatred that came from Lilith's #1 op, Graf Zahl. If the name Graf Zahl sounds a bit familiar to you, it might be because he happens to be the lead developer of GZ Doom. You know, that one super advanced source port that can supposedly run every single Doom mod. Except for Lilith. When the buzz around Lilith started going around, Graf was understandably displeased by the notion that a Doom WOD wasn't meant to run on GZ Doom. The WOD even goes as far as to punish you for not using the appropriate source port. Graf saw this as an attack on his ego, and would go on to openly insult this WOD and anyone who dared sing its praises. Whether or not Graf's frustration was justified, his sudden outburst would send shockwaves across the community. Since the initial thread that Lilith was first showcased in ended up getting locked, it would seem that the smoke had already cleared. The only thing that could possibly make this situation worse is if they gave Lilith a CAC award that same year. And so that same year, Lilith was given a CAC award. In retrospect, of course it deserved one. Despite the controversy with Graf Zahl hanging over the community like a stone, most people would agree that Lilith was an impressive WOD. However, it doesn't seem like a coincidence that it was placed neatly at the very top of the list. It would be fair to theorize that whoever was in charge of ranking the CAC award selections purposely gave Lilith first prize in an attempt to ruffle a certain someone's feathers. And it was only a matter of moments before Graf himself would emerge from the shadows once more to air his grievances. While everyone else in the CAC award discussion thread were hooting and hollering, Graf would decide to butt in and rain on this parade. So how does a totally mediocre project like Legacy of Heroes get a CAC award, and an absolutely outstanding masterpiece like Waterlab merely end up as a runner-up? What about Lilith? Why do people like such a visual piece of garbage? The CAC awards have become just like the Oscars. The backlash that Graf received was so bad that at some point his user title on Doomworld was jokingly set to Salty Member. You know you've seriously messed up if the admins on a forum site actually joined in on the dogpiling. It was all fun and games, until it wasn't. For the next few days after this incident, Graf Zahl would seemingly disappear from the forums. Other members of GZ Doom's development team were trying to get into contact with him, only to be met with radio silence. Imagine witnessing the lead developer of a source port get universally clowned on, and then he just suddenly vanishes. One could only assume the worst. Did Graf Zahl give up? Had the controversy in the wake of Lilith gone to his head? Is GZ diddly doom done diddly done for? Turns out he just went on vacation and didn't tell anyone. By the end of the 2010s, GZ Doom had become so sophisticated that some consider it to be an entire game engine, with its only shortcoming being the piss-ugly default settings. Many standalone games and total conversions rely on GZ Doom's sheer powerhouse of features, making it... what's this now? Oh, nice, that Total Chaos game that got announced like over a decade ago finally came out. What? Oh, I see, you want me to review it, don't you? Oh, well then just go watch the Furry Inflation Guy, I don't have that kind of time. With the influx of new modding tools and advanced map formats, the untouched potential of the Doom engine was becoming larger than any had thought possible. But there was one mod in particular that would show not just the community, but the entire world, that when it came to Doom modding, the real limit was your imagination.
Now, it's gonna start, and we're gonna drive it over to your house.
My house?
Yes, your house. We're gonna drive it over there and park it overnight, and then tomorrow...
Man, not my house!
I do have to preface something real quick. To the 12 million people who are already familiar with my house, there's not a whole lot I can say about it that hasn't already been said a dozen times before. If you're expecting me to give a full rundown on all the juicy details, secrets, and lore, well, this isn't quite the place. What I will say, however, is that although both this project and its creator seemingly came out of nowhere with no further elaboration, that isn't necessarily the case. To understand the premise of my house, we also have to understand the guy who made it. Steve Nelson, aka Veg, was a fairly prominent user of the Doomworld forums during the mid-2000s. However, after late October 2006, Veg would seemingly vanish off the face of the site. There's not really a concrete reason for his sudden disappearance, though it likely has something to do with the fact that around this time he was attending college. It wouldn't be until September 2022 when Veg would make his grand return. The first thing he posted since his hiatus were some screenshots of a rather sentimental map that he was working on, a scale recreation of his childhood home. The map in question was supposedly made many years ago by his late friend, and recently Veg had uncovered the floppy disk that contained this map. So in his honor, Veg would take it upon himself to finish what his friend had started. Veg would also leave comments on a few other different threads prior to my house's release. He would go on to mention that he'd been having trouble sleeping for the past couple months, saying that it was happening around the same time he started working on this project. He would also leave a comment on the thread for Sensory Deprivation Chamber, an advanced map set known for its interesting design. Playing this mod leaves the player feeling very uneasy. What was your motivation? During the process, did you ever feel like the map had a mind of its own? Like you were just a guiding force in the editor, but the map took over? On March 3rd, 2023, Veg would finally get this tribute map out the door. Heartfelt messages and all. My house was presented under the guise that it was a simple 10-minute experience, not posing much of a challenge either. Apparently since the 90s, it was always a bit of a trend to make Doom levels modeled after your own house. So the idea of releasing a My House style level in the present day seemed inoffensive at worst. However, it wouldn't take long before players would have the curtains pulled right before their eyes. We all love a good old-fashioned bait and switch. It's a tried and true feature of some of the most successful indie titles. You think you're in for a wholesome or mundane experience when all of a sudden, Although My House's twist happens fairly early on, it doesn't make itself obvious at first. The casual, unsuspecting player would go through most of the first phase of the level without noticing much, but anyone with a keen eye would notice very subtle changes that would happen as they progress. The level has been purposely constructed to misdirect you and lead you right into an inescapable path. It is possible to beat the level normally, so to speak, but the chances of first-time players actually doing this were pretty thin, as they would have likely noticed the Soul Sphere placed alluringly on the outside part of the map, only to see that the Soul Sphere was merely a red herring. But by this point, the player had already taken the bait hook, line, and sinker, and they were already on their way down the rabbit hole. What My House does a good job at is toying with the player's nerves by making it seem like as though the very world around them is slowly beginning to ensnare them. Eventually you'll find some sort of gateway to escape the confines of the house, although I use the word escape very loosely. As you would soon find out, the titular house would be merely a front end through an entire array of different otherworldly set pieces. Each one has their own points of interest and items necessary for progressing through the map, as well as some vague narrative implications. Despite the mysterious nature of both My House and its creator, it does very much wear its influences on its sleeves. Anyone who's been on the internet for longer than 5 minutes might already be familiar with the concept of liminal spaces. They're often described as man-made rooms or places that appear empty and devoid of life. Most examples would be places like offices, hallways, playgrounds, and indoor pools, although sometimes these spaces might take on a more unnatural form. Most of my house's set pieces are very much inspired by this phenomenon, and the ability to craft this type of atmosphere in such a primitive game engine is what makes it such an exemplary achievement in Doom mapping. After finally getting all the artifacts necessary to get the true ending of the game, you might think the story simply ends there. And you'd be right, but included in the WODs folder are some bits and pieces for any super sleuths who might be interested. The most interesting document here is this journal that Nelson wrote, providing more insight and backstory to this project. Some of the journal's entries would describe some of the bizarre dreams that Nelson experienced whilst he was developing this WOD. During the latter part of this journal, Nelson would mention how while he was trying to work on the map, he would encounter a lot of oddities and claim that the map itself seemed as though it had a mind of its own. This overtly suggests the idea that there's some kind of supernatural element at play here. One of the photos included in the game's folder is an obituary for Thomas Allard, the aforementioned childhood friend of Veg. However, there's another obituary that can be found by finding this secret QR code. This time it's for... what the fuck? Steve Nelson's dead? Well then who uploaded the WOD then? Was it a ghost? The open-endedness of this WOD's narrative would inspire many of its players to ponder and theorize. What's the significance of all these locations? If Steve Nelson is supposedly dead, then who's really behind the Veg account? Did any of the story beats surrounding this WOD even happen? The truth stands, however, that my house is more than just a showcase on what can be done with GZ Doom's rich set of features. It's an interactive tale of grief, isolation, and trying to make sense of life's biggest mysteries. Since the WOD's inception, there's been a dramatic amount of new eyes being drawn towards the Doomsphere, even if for a fleeting moment of virality. There's even a few people who are convinced to get themselves a copy of House of Leaves. Some of the internet's biggest names would even get in on the action.
I could have sex with it.
Including John Romero himself, one of id Software's co-founders.
Is that an Enderman over there?
Although nowadays some people might think my house is, like, so last year, it's hard to ignore why a project of such a scope would make this many waves. At the end of the day, maybe my real house was the friends I made along the way. And then they tried to dox the creator. You would think that after having seen all the endings and found all the secrets and watched all the analysis videos, that players would be satisfied with this conclusion. But they weren't. They knew there had to be more to it than that. Some people would take my house's ARG-style approach a little too seriously, and in a matter of days their little pseudo-investigation would spill beyond the boundaries of the game and into the real world. To this day, Veg has been 100% radio silent ever since the release of my house. Some theorize that his abrupt disappearance is all a part of the act and that he's just making it seem like he died. Others think Veg might be an alt account for some other user on Doomworld. The question on people's minds was just who is this Veg guy? I mean, no one just casually drops such a phenomenal game and still remains a complete mystery to the world, right? Right? With the amount of attention that my house was getting, it was only a matter of time before its official thread would start to get littered by some rather undesirable posts. There was the odd user who would bring up the possibility that the house depicted in the WOD could be real. Some users even went the extra mile and managed to find actual information regarding both the house and the residents there. Obviously, these posts would immediately get struck down. But whenever people weren't trying to find the house, they were trying to find Veg. People legitimately thought solving the mystery behind Veg's identity was all part of the game. And in case you're wondering, yes, there was even a small handful of those subhuman critters who were trying to get the map working with brutal doom. Which sounds about as sacrilegious as... you know what? Let's not talk about that. People higher up in the Doomworld pecking order were starting to get a bit impatient with these people trying to look into what was essentially a closed book. Did that stop them? Of course not. Eventually it got to the point where they had to temporarily put this thread in the timeout corner. The thread would remain locked for some time, but it was eventually reinstated in the hopes that everyone had learnt their lesson. For the most part, everyone was on their best behavior, but at this point the fire was already starting to die down a bit.
If I fail this run, I'm gonna punch someone.